The translation finished loading at 4:47 in the morning, and the first thing I noticed was that the veil had addressed it to no one. No specific government, no command structure, no named individual in any recognized diplomatic registry. They had broadcasted on every open frequency their systems could reach, aimed it at every inhabited star system within 300 light-years, and simply let it go. It was a signal sent into the dark the way you might write a letter and set it on fire, not because you expected anyone to read it, but because you needed to do something with the words before the end came. I read the full translation twice before I let myself breathe. The Drath Imperial Armada had arrived in the Veil system 11 days ago. In 11 days, they had reduced 3 inhabited planets to conditions that the Veil translation described only as no longer suitable for life. The 4th planet was holding, but barely. 290 million civilians were sheltering in its deep underground networks, listening to the bombardment from above and transmitting everything they could think to transmit, because silence felt too close to surrender. The 5th planet had launched evacuation ships in the first 3 hours of the attack. The transmission did not include their destination. The people sending the signal did not know if those ships had survived long enough to need a destination. 9 minutes and 14 seconds. That was the length of the transmission. I was alone in the office when it landed on my terminal. That was not unusual. I had kept irregular hours for most of my career, and the overnight staff at the Geneva Coordination Center had long since accepted that my light would be on before sunrise. What was unusual was the routing path the signal had taken to reach me. 14 relay stations, passing through the dead inboxes of 3 former diplomats, routed through a decommissioned subroutine that technically should not have been active, and landing on my terminal with the quiet, insistent persistence of something that had traveled a very long way and was not willing to be ignored. The signal had been looking for someone. It found me. I refilled my coffee and read the last paragraph one more time. We do not anticipate a response from Earth. You are too young, too far, too unknown to the weight of these decisions. We transmit only because we wish someone to know we existed before the end. Farewell, small world. I sat with those words for a while. Earth had been a registered observer nation in the Galactic Assembly for 31 years. Observer status meant that we received certain diplomatic communications, attended select assembly sessions without voting rights, and were treated the way the youngest student at a very old school tends to be treated, with a mixture of mild curiosity and the kind of careful patience that is not quite the same thing as respect. We had submitted 3 applications for full membership. 2 had been declined because our interstellar drive technology did not meet the minimum threshold for certified long-range transit. The 3rd had been under review for 9 years without any response whatsoever. Too young, too far, too unknown. I had heard versions of that phrase in some form at every assembly session I had ever attended. The Galactic Assembly had 47 member species. 31 of them had been crossing between star systems before humans had developed written language. They were not cruel about our position. They simply could not conceive of us as relevant to the situations that carried actual weight. We were catalogued. We were noted. We were set aside. I closed the translation document and opened the requisition terminal. The Geneva Coordination Center manages the logistics of every joint military operation involving more than 3 national fleets. Every deployment request, every equipment transfer, every emergency authorization moves through this building and goes before a committee of 17 people who review it on a standard 14-day cycle. That process exists for good reasons. Accountability, measured judgment. The institutional discipline that keeps individuals from making large, irreversible decisions alone in the middle of the night. There is, however, a provision in the emergency protocol framework for a Class 1 declaration. A Class 1 declaration is reserved for situations that cannot survive a 14-day review. It bypasses the committee entirely. It goes out on the sole authorization of the Emergency Logistics Director, time-stamped, logged, and non-reversible from the moment of filing. I had held that role for 11 years. I had never once used it. I started typing. The justification field had a limit of 500 words. I used 43. Galaxy-class humanitarian emergency, confirmed by direct transmission. Species-level extinction event in progress. Requesting full deployment authorization for all reserve fleet assets, all active fleet assets, and all experimental yard vessels currently designated as non-operational pending official commission. Emergency authorization effective immediately. See attached audio file. I attached all 9 minutes and 14 seconds. I filed it. The system returned a confirmation. Pending committee review, estimated processing time 14 business days. I looked at that message for exactly 4 seconds. Then I picked up the direct line to Admiral Pete Harlow. He answered on the second ring. He always answered on the second ring. 28 years of service had rebuilt his nervous system around the assumption that any call arriving between midnight and dawn was the only call that actually mattered. I had always respected that about him, even when it made him difficult to surprise. I told him everything: the transmission, the routing path, the 43 words in the justification field. I told him that the fourth planet was still broadcasting, and that the evacuation ships from the fifth planet might still be alive out there somewhere, moving through a system currently occupied by the full force of a Drath armada that had already demonstrated 3 times over exactly what it intended to do. Then I read him the last paragraph. The line was quiet. "How long have you been building toward this?" he said. Outside my window, the Geneva skyline was still dark. The city below had no idea. The street lamps were on, and the night transit was running its quiet cycles, and everything was precisely as ordinary as it always was in the last calm hour before something very large changes direction. 22 years, I said. I heard him stand up. I heard the specific, decisive sound of a man who had already made up his mind before he was fully awake enough to realize it. "I will make the calls," he said. "Get to your bridge." The committee review was bypassed by executive order at 5:12 that morning. Fleet authorization codes began transmitting at 5:30. Before I left the office, I went back to my terminal and opened the audio file one final time. Not the translation. The raw signal passed through the frequency engine until the Veil's subsonic distress call was rendered within human hearing range. Once the machine finished processing it, it did not sound like what I had expected. It sounded like wind moving through an empty building, like something large and hollow, breathing its last breath outward and upward into a sky that was not listening. I played the last 9 seconds. On the corner of my desk sat a small piece of broken hardware, a heating coil from the ESV Kurosawa, a ship I had commanded for 8 months before a debris field in a training corridor took it along with every one of its 340 crew members. The coil had not functioned since the day I pulled it from the wreck. I had carried it for 22 years. It served no purpose. It had no explanation. It was simply a thing I had never been able to put down. I put it in my breast pocket. Then I walked out and went to make the Veil wrong about us. The first ship authorization that cleared at 5:30 in the morning was a carrier group out of the Pacific Command. By 6, 3 more groups had confirmed. By 7, the calls were coming faster than my coordination staff could log them, and the overnight skeleton crew in the main operations floor had swelled to a full shift of people who had come in early because the communications channels had simply not stopped moving. I stood at the operations rail on the coordination center's main floor and watched the deployment map fill in. I had designed that map with a particular vision in mind. It was not a vision I had shared with committees or review boards. I had built it the way some people build things in private, steadily, quietly, over many years, with the absolute conviction that the moment you were building toward would eventually arrive, even if you could not specify when. The ESV Resolute was already in orbital assembly position. She was my flagship, and she had been ready for 6 months, because I had spent 6 months making her ready in the way you make a thing ready when you are absolutely certain of a future that nobody around you has acknowledged yet. Captain Neil Cross met me at the bridge with a tablet and the expression of a man who had been awake for approximately 90 minutes and had spent all of it processing information that kept changing scale. Current confirmed deployment count is 1,042 capital ships, he said. Reserve fleet is still coming online. Experimental yard releases are waiting on the secondary authorization codes. Send me the codes, I said. I will sign them. Admiral, some of those ships have never completed a full shakedown run. I am aware. He looked at me for a moment. Then he handed me the tablet and did not say anything else, because Neil Cross was the kind of person who understood when an argument had already been decided. I signed every authorization on the list. By 8:00 that morning, the count was 2,011. By noon, it was 3,400. We had 3 alien diplomatic attachés stationed aboard the Resolute. They had been there for 2 years, observing Earth's military coordination activities as part of an assembly transparency agreement that had been signed largely because the assembly did not believe there was anything particularly significant to observe. Velshan represented the Torathi. Gresham spoke for the Selori Compact. A third attaché, a Dravathi named Ailing Kor, had spent most of the past 2 years writing reports about human administrative inefficiency. All 3 of them were on the observation deck when the 72-hour assembly completed. I walked in and stood beside them and looked at the display alongside them without saying anything. The orbital deployment map showed the full formation above Earth's rings, column after column of vessels arranged in the deep space transit configuration, running lights across the formation like a city that had decided to move. 4,216 capital ships. Plus support. Velshan was quiet for a long time. The Torathi had a way of processing surprise that manifested as absolute physical stillness, and Velshan was so still that I briefly wondered if the atmospheric regulator in her suit had malfunctioned. "How many ships?" she said finally. It was not quite a question. It was what a person says when they already know the answer but need to hear it stated plainly before they can trust it. I checked my screen, though I already knew the number. 4,216 capital ships, I said, plus approximately 900 support and logistics vessels. Velshan looked at me. We did not know Earth had 4,000 capital ships. I poured myself a coffee from the carafe on the side table. No, I said, you didn't. I said it without particular emphasis. I said it the way you might confirm that water is wet. I was not angry when I said it. I was not triumphant. I was simply noting a fact about the distance between what the Galactic Assembly had assumed about us and what had been true the entire time. That gap, that precise, enormous decades-wide gap, was the point. Gresham, the Selori attaché, turned from the window and asked how long Earth had been building a fleet of this size. I thought about the question for a moment before I answered. Earth had been building this fleet the way it had always built the things it needed most. Not all at once, not with fanfare, not with any announcement that might invite interference or comment from observers who had already decided what we were capable of. We had built it in pieces, in reserve yards, in experimental programs that sat quietly at the edge of budget allocations for years at a time. We had built it the way a person who has already been told no too many times builds something, privately, persistently, and with the particular focus of someone who has decided that the world's opinion of the project is simply not relevant. Long enough, I said. Velshan looked back at the deployment display. Her stillness had shifted into something that I recognized, after years of working with Torathi diplomatic staff, as the specific quality of attention that their species gives to things they have fundamentally misjudged. I left them on the observation deck and went back to my bridge. On my desk, where I had set it when I sat down that morning, was the broken heating coil from the Kurosawa. I touched it once, the way I always touched it when I sat down. It was cold. It was always cold. The internal resistance wire had fused in the accident, and no amount of replacement parts had ever made it work again. I had replaced every other component over the years. The coil still did not work. I sat down. I pulled up the departure clock. I looked at the 4,216 ships assembled above the planet that had been told it was too small and too young and too unknown to matter, and I noted the time. We departed at 300 on the fourth day. Every ship in formation. No delay, no last-minute cancellations, no equipment failures that couldn't be managed en route. The Galactic Assembly's Observer Network detected our departure signature 12 minutes after we left. Their automated monitoring system filed it under unclassified mass movement, Earth origin, threat classification pending review. The review would take, under standard protocol, 14 business days. We would be there in 11. The Alcubierre Tanaka sequential fold drive was a human development. The Galactic Assembly had reviewed the theoretical framework for it 20 years earlier and rated it as plausible in concept, but practically infeasible for vessels above a certain mass threshold. They had specifically noted that coordinating the drive across multiple ships simultaneously would introduce cascade instability that no known navigation system could reliably manage. We managed it across 4,216 ships at once. I want to be clear that this was not comfortable. The first fold transition, executed at 600 on day 1, felt like the Resolute had been briefly and completely taken apart at the molecular level and put back together by a system that was reasonably confident it had gotten the order right. Several crew members described it as the worst experience of their lives. Dr. K. Burton, my senior science officer, described it as extraordinary in a tone that suggested she found the distress of others slightly interesting from a research standpoint. Neil Cross held the edge of his console and said nothing at all, which was how he handled most things. By the third transition, the crew had adapted. By the fifth, nobody mentioned it anymore. The void between Earth and the Veil system was not empty. It was not the featureless dark that people who have never traveled through it tend to imagine. It was filled with the ordinary debris of old solar systems, dust clouds, dead rock, the occasional wandering mass that had been traveling in the same direction for several billion years without any particular destination. Our navigation charts were good for approximately 60% of the route. The rest was LT. Lily Ford working at her station, with the concentrated expression of someone solving a calculation that would not stop moving. I spent the first 3 days reviewing tactical assessments. The Drath Imperial Armada was not an unknown quantity. We had intelligence on them, good intelligence, gathered over 31 years of careful, quiet attention to an organization that had never considered us worth watching in return. We knew their formation preferences. We knew their command structure. We knew that their fleet doctrine was built around a principle of overwhelming force applied in sequence, which had served them well against every opponent they had faced, because every opponent they had faced had been working from similar doctrinal assumptions. They had never fought an opponent who was not working from their assumptions. I spent days 4 through 6 reviewing the specific tactical adaptations I had spent the last decade developing for exactly this situation. Neil Cross sat across from me for most of those sessions and asked the right questions, and occasionally told me when something would not work in practice the way it worked in theory, which was useful and occasionally annoying. On day 7, The long-range sensors picked up a draft monitoring buoy. Draft monitoring buoys are automated systems designed to log ship traffic along known transit corridors. They record vessel type, heading, drive signature, and approximate mass. They are not particularly sophisticated. They were not designed with the assumption that anything outside a standard classification profile would ever need to be recorded. Our drive signatures were outside every classification profile they had. The buoy logged us, attempted to categorize us, failed, attempted again, failed again, and transmitted what it had collected to the nearest draft relay station. LT Owen Gray at Communications intercepted the buoy's outgoing transmission before it cleared our jamming range and handed me the intercept log. The automated draft assessment AI had processed our fleet's approach and attempted to file it under a threat classification category. The entry read, anomalous contact biological origin approaching on bearing consistent with Veil engagement zone, drive signature unregistered, mass signature unregistered, classification attempt, scout class vessel, error, mass exceeds scout class threshold by a factor of, and then the entry ended. The AI had apparently tried to continue its calculation, run into a number it did not have a category for, and forwarded the file to a supervisor algorithm. I folded the intercept printout once and set it down. I said. Velshan, who had been reviewing long-range sensor data at the secondary console, looked up. What does it say? It says their classification AI tried to figure out what we are, I said. Then it gave up and asked a supervisor. She looked at the printout. And what will the supervisor determine? I picked up my coffee. That's a good question. The answer, based on the follow-up intercept we received 4 hours later, was that the supervisor algorithm had escalated the contact to a live draft intelligence officer, who had reviewed the data, reportedly requested clarification 3 times, and then filed an emergency communication to the Armada Command currently occupying the Veil system. We were still 2 days out. I went back to my quarters that night and sat at my desk in the dark for a while, not sleeping, not reviewing files, just sitting. I opened the audio file. 9 minutes and 14 seconds. I had listened to it several times now. I knew every shift in the signal's frequency. I knew where the transmission became more urgent, where it seemed to falter, where something in the transmission modulation suggested that the person or people generating it had paused, perhaps to look at something outside a window or above a shelter ceiling before continuing. I played the last 9 seconds and let them sit in the air of my quarters. Farewell, small world. The 4th planet was still transmitting when we had last received a relay update. That had been 18 hours ago. A lot could happen in 18 hours. I knew that. I sat with it. I took the coil out of my pocket and set it on the desk. It sat there, small and useless and unchanged, exactly as it had always been. I did not pick it up again. I went to sleep. At 400 on day 11 LT, Ford's voice came through the shipwide channel, calm and precise. Final transit in 4 minutes, all hands to stations. I was already dressed, I was already moving. The void snapped closed behind us, and the Veil system opened ahead, and before the display screens had finished rendering what was out there, the first numbers from the sensor sweep were already coming in. I read them. I sat down. I read them again. The sensor sweep took 90 seconds to complete. It felt much longer. The Veil system had 5 planets. I had known that going in. The draft had been here for 22 days now, and I had been watching the numbers from the last relay intercepts and running quiet calculations in the back of my mind during every fold transition, working the math of what 22 days meant at the rate the bombardment had been progressing. The math had told me something I had not wanted to confirm. The sensors confirmed it. 3 planets, atmospheric readings, surface temperature readings, biological activity indicators. All three registered at levels consistent with complete surface sterilization. No signals, no transmissions, no heat signatures consistent with life. Just three enormous masses moving through their orbital paths around a star that no longer had anyone looking at it from below. 3 planets. 140 years of spaceflight. 47 member species. A galactic assembly that held sessions about interstellar law and diplomatic protocol and the proper framework for civilizational interaction. 3 planets. Admiral Neil Cross spoke quietly. He was looking at the same display. 4th planet is still broadcasting. Surface temperature has risen another 6 degrees since last relay. Atmospheric contamination is in early stages. He paused. We have time, not a lot, but some. How much? 8 to 12 hours before surface habitability drops below sustainable threshold. Maybe 14 if they have deep enough shelter networks. 8 to 12 hours. The Drath Armada was positioned in a standard consolidation formation around the 4th planet's orbital zone. 640 warships, arranged in the layered engagement pattern I had studied for a decade. From our entry point at the edge of the system, they were reading our approach on their sensors right now. I knew that because I could see their formation already beginning to adjust. The outer ring ships rotating to face our bearing, a slight compression in the middle tiers that suggested a defensive reconfiguration. They were trying to categorize us. I knew exactly what their sensors were telling them. Thousands of drive signatures, mass readings that did not fit any existing classification, weapons profiles that did not match any registered Earth vessel type, because the ships carrying those profiles had never been officially registered anywhere. The Drath Supreme Commander opened a hail channel at 6:14. He was large. All Drath military command were large, built along lines that suggested their species had resolved most of their evolutionary challenges through the straightforward application of mass. He was bioluminescent in a deep blue-green pattern that I had read in my intelligence briefings, indicated high authority status. He filled the display screen the way large things fill small frames. He introduced himself as Grand Commander Krathvel of the Drath Imperial 3rd Expansionary Armada. He said it in the standard assembly diplomatic language, which the Resolute's translation Sweet handled without difficulty. He offered us withdrawal without consequence. He used the word mercy. He said he had no interest in conflict with a young species that had wandered into a situation beyond its experience. He said that Earth's presence in this system, while unexpected, would be noted in the Armada's engagement records as an act of misguided bravery, and that the Imperial Command would view our departure as the wise choice of a civilization that understood its own limitations. He said this in the measured, unhurried tone of someone who had said similar things to different people many times before, and for whom the conversations had always concluded the same way. I let him finish. Then I looked at him for a moment without speaking. You sent a signal to Earth, I said. The Veil sent that signal. You allowed it because you believed we would not come. He said nothing. We came. I cut the channel. Sam Briggs, my weapons officer, was at his station. He looked at me. He did not ask for an order. He was a precise person who understood exactly where we were in the sequence of events and was waiting for the single word that would move us from one phase to the next. I looked at the display. The 4th planet sat below the Drath formation, its surface temperature still rising. 290 million living things somewhere in the deep networks beneath that ground, transmitting and waiting, and not knowing that the sky above them had just filled with something the Drath had never planned for. I reached into my breast pocket and touched the coil. I thought about the Kurosawa, not the ship, not the wreck, the 340 names. I could still recite them all from memory if I started at the beginning, and I did sometimes recite them in the quiet when the nights were long enough and the weight of carrying them needed somewhere to go. I thought about a 9th minute and a 14th second, and a voice saying farewell to a world it believed was too small to answer. "All ships," I said. I paused, not for effect, just because I wanted the next words to be right. "File it under, not today." The Resolute's weapons systems came online across every station simultaneously. Through the hull, I could feel the particular vibration of a ship that has stopped holding itself back. All around us, across 4,216 vessels, the same thing was happening. The Drath formation had never seen anything like what came next. The first engagement wave lasted 40 minutes. The Drath formation responded the way their doctrine required. Outer ring ships rotated to present maximum shield coverage. The middle tier compressed inward to protect the command vessels. Long-range weapons platforms in the rear activated their targeting systems and began their lock sequences. Their doctrine assumed an opposing force would do what opposing forces always did: establish position, probe for weaknesses, and engage in the kind of calculated exchange that large fleet actions had followed for as long as anyone in the Galactic Assembly had records of large fleet actions. Our ships did not do that. Neil Cross had spent 3 years helping me develop what we simply called variable engagement. The idea was not complicated. It was built on the observation that a species that had spent most of its written history finding ways to fight enemies larger, better equipped, and more established than itself had developed certain instincts that did not translate neatly into the standard assembly framework for fleet doctrine. Humans did not wait to be attacked. Humans did not establish position first. Humans went directly at the thing that frightened them, because they had learned, repeatedly and at great cost, that hesitation in the presence of superior numbers was simply a slower way to lose. The first wave crossed the engagement threshold at speeds the Drath targeting systems were not calibrated to track. The outer ring of the Drath formation took concentrated fire from 6 directions simultaneously before its first return volley had finished acquiring targets. 4 Drath warships in the outer tier lost propulsion in the first 12 minutes. 2 more had their weapons systems disabled without being destroyed, a deliberate targeting choice, because we were not here to destroy. We were here to stop. The Drath Supreme Commander opened a second channel at the 19-minute mark. He was no longer using the tone of someone extending mercy. I did not take the call. By the end of the first 40 minutes, the Drath outer formation had been pulled apart, not destroyed, pulled, separated from its supporting tiers, its coordination disrupted, its command signals jammed on the frequencies our intelligence had identified 2 years earlier. Grand Commander Krathvel was still operational. His command ship was heavily damaged but intact. The middle tiers were still fighting, but they were fighting the way a formation fights when it has lost the outer layer that was supposed to define the edges of the engagement. Uncertainly, reactively, without the clean geometry that their doctrine required. I watched the tactical display and thought about nothing other than the 4th planet and the 12-hour window, and the number that was now just under 10 hours. Sam Briggs called me at the 43-minute mark. "Their middle tier is breaking formation," he said. 3 command vessels in the second tier are beginning a withdrawal vector. "Are the rest following?" "Not yet. The outer ring ships that are still mobile are holding position. I think the Grand Commander is trying to reorganize." "Give him something to reorganize around," I said. "Push the left flank of the outer ring into his middle tier's line of sight. Make it look like we are trying to find a gap." Briggs understood. He relayed the order. The Drath middle tier responded the way their doctrine said to respond when a flanking move threatened to open a path to the command ships. They collapsed inward. It was the correct response by their standards. It created the gap we actually needed. 15 support ships carrying the emergency atmospheric treatment packages moved through that gap at 8:01. By 8:23, they were in position above the fourth planet. The atmospheric treatment was not a weapon. It was the opposite of a weapon. It was a piece of technology that Earth had developed quietly over 30 years, designed for exactly the kind of planetary-scale atmospheric contamination that the Drath's orbital bombardment produced. 4 hours of sustained treatment would halt the contamination cycle. 8 hours would begin reversal. We had 10 hours left in the window. The Grand Commander opened a third channel at 8:30. This time I answered. He looked at me across the display and I looked back at him, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. His bioluminescence had shifted from blue-green to something darker and more complex, and I did not need an attaché briefing to understand what that shift meant. "What are you doing to the fourth planet?" he said. "Repairing it," I said. He was quiet. "You cannot win this engagement," he said. "You have caused significant disruption. I acknowledge that. Your fleet's capabilities were not accurately assessed. I acknowledge that also. But you are outnumbered, and the Drath Armada does not accept tactical defeat as a permanent condition." I thought about how to answer that. "How many species," I said, "have told you something similar?" He did not answer. "We are not trying to win," I said. "We are trying to stop. There is a difference. A fleet that is trying to win needs to defeat you. A fleet that is trying to stop just needs to keep your weapons offline long enough for 290 million people to still be alive when this is over." He looked at me. "You came all this way," he said, "for strangers." "Yes." "Why?" I could hear, in the way he said the word, that it was a genuine question, not a rhetorical one, not a challenge or a negotiating position. He genuinely did not understand the answer, and the not understanding was the part that was costing him something. "Because they asked," I said, "and because nobody else was coming." I held the channel open for another few seconds, and then I closed it. The engagement continued. It lasted 4 more hours. The Drath Armada did not break. I want to be clear about that, because this is not a story about an enemy that ran. The Drath were disciplined, experienced, and deeply committed to not being the first armada in their history to disengage from an opponent they had not expected. They fought the way the very large fight when they discover that size alone is not the deciding factor, with tremendous force, increasingly unfocused, and with a growing sense that the rules of the engagement had changed in ways their training had not prepared them for. We lost 47 ships. 47. 19,004 crew members. I did not learn the exact number until Owen Gray handed me the preliminary casualty report at 12:47, and I read it the way I read all casualty reports, completely, from beginning to end, without stopping, because every name on a list like that was a person who deserved to be read and not skimmed. I read it standing at my station. Neil Cross stood nearby. He did not say anything. He knew me well enough to know that this was not a moment for words. He simply stood there, which was the right thing to do. The Drath Armada completed its withdrawal at 13:01. Not a retreat. An organized withdrawal executed in formation, with the Grand Commander's command ship moving last. It was, as an act of military discipline, impressive. I noted that honestly. They were good at what they did. They were simply unprepared for the specific thing we were. At 13:09 LT, Ford confirmed that the fourth planet's atmospheric treatment was holding. Surface temperature had stopped rising. The contamination cycle had been interrupted. The underground shelter networks were still intact. 290 million people were still alive. I sat down at my station and held the preliminary casualty report and said nothing for a while. Then I put it on my desk, face down, next to the broken heating coil. Tomorrow I would start learning the 19,000 names. I would go through them one by one, the way I had gone through 340 names once before, and I would carry each of them in the same place I carried all the others. There was room. There is always room for the names of people who trusted you with their lives. You find the space. But that was tomorrow. The Vale Council requested a formal meeting at 1500 that afternoon. They came up to orbital altitude in 3 ships that moved with the careful, deliberate grace of a civilization that had been reduced from 5 planets to 1, and was still in the process of determining what that meant for every decision going forward. The ships were old, not poorly maintained, old in the way that things become old when a people has been building and rebuilding across centuries, accumulating history in the structure of everything they make. I met their delegation in the Resolute's main conference bay. The Vale were tall, not imposing, tall the way trees are tall, with a quality of vertical extension that suggested their original homeworld had given them reason to reach upward. Their skin ranged in color across the deep blue and violet spectrum, and they moved with a slightly translucent quality in their extremities that I had read, in my briefing documents, was an involuntary indicator of strong emotion. Their extremities were almost entirely translucent right now. The first speaker introduced herself as Ael Voss. She was the head of what remained of the Vale civilian government, a role that, 22 days ago, had come with the responsibility of coordinating 5 planets and a population of approximately 2 billion. She now coordinated 1 planet and a significantly revised number. She looked at me across the conference table with an expression that I could not fully read, because Vale facial structures were not the same as human ones, and the translation suite only handled language. But the quality of her attention was unmistakable. She was looking at me the way people look at things they are not sure are real yet. I offered the Vale delegation water and what the ship's kitchen had put together as the closest equivalent to a formal reception that we could manage on 4 hours' notice in the aftermath of a fleet engagement. One of the secondary delegates, a young Vale male who had not been introduced, looked at the water glasses for a long time before picking one up. He did not drink from it. He just held it. I understood that. Ael Voss opened the formal discussion with the standard assembly greeting protocol, which she moved through quickly in a way that suggested she understood it was a formality and was willing to observe it without letting it delay the conversation that actually needed to happen. Then she was quiet for a moment. "We were not sure the 4th planet would survive this morning," she said. "It will," I said. "The atmospheric treatment needs another 6 hours to complete the reversal cycle, but the contamination progression has been fully interrupted. Your underground networks held." She absorbed that. Something moved through her expression that I could not name exactly, but which had the quality of a person physically setting a weight down. "We received your fleet's approach on our sensors 8 hours before arrival," she said. "Our remaining military command did not believe what the sensors were showing." "What did they think it was?" "An error," she looked at me steadily. "We had transmitted our signal believing that no response was possible, the distances involved, the timeline, the assembly's standard response protocols." She paused. "We transmitted because we did not want to end in silence. We did not transmit because we believed anyone would come." "I know," I said. The room was quiet for a moment. "Your signal found me at 4:47 in the morning," I said. "Geneva Coordination Center, 4th floor, northeastern office. I was the only person awake in the building." Ael Voss looked at me with an expression that was, I thought, something close to confusion. "1 person received the signal. 1 person filed the authorization," I said. "The signal found my terminal because of a routing path through some decommissioned systems and a lot of dead diplomatic inboxes. If it had arrived 12 minutes later, the overnight logging system would have archived it for review." The young Vale delegate, who had been holding the water glass, looked up. Aelva's extremities were almost fully translucent now. She asked the question I had known was coming since the moment her ships had docked. She asked it carefully, in the assembly diplomatic language, with the phrasing of someone who had been composing the question for several hours and was still not entirely certain they had the words right. "Why did Earth come?" she said. "You were not obligated. You were not formally allied with the Veil. You had no strategic interest in this system. The Drath Armada has never threatened Earth directly. By every standard framework of galactic diplomacy and military doctrine, there was no reason for you to come." She leaned forward slightly. "Why did you come?" I had a number of answers available that were technically accurate: strategic deterrence value, precedent setting for future Assembly membership applications, demonstration of Earth's operational capability to relevant galactic powers. I knew how to give those answers. I had given similar answers in committee rooms and review sessions for most of my adult life. They were true. They were also not the answer. "Your signal said you wanted someone to know you existed before the end," I said. Aelva waited. "We knew," I said. I said nothing else. The room held that for a long moment. Aelva did not speak for nearly 30 seconds. When she did, her voice was quieter than it had been. "You lost ships today," she said. "Your people." "Yes. Because of us." I thought about how to answer that in a way that was true. "They came because they chose to come," I said. "Every person on every ship in this fleet knew what we were flying into. They knew before we departed. There were no surprises. And they came anyway." "Yes." She looked at me for a long time. "Small world," she said softly. It was the same phrase, the same 2 words from the last line of the transmission. She said it differently now, not as a farewell, not as a diminishment. She said it the way you say something when you have discovered that the size you assigned to a thing was wrong from the beginning. I did not correct her. I did not explain it. I just nodded. We spent another 2 hours in formal session. There were practical matters to address: the ongoing treatment of the 4th planet's atmosphere, the status of the 5th planet's evacuation ships, which our long-range sensors had located 11 hours earlier, moving through deep space on an erratic heading consistent with emergency transit without a planned destination. They were alive. All of them. We had 2 ships moving to make contact. There were questions about the Drath Armada's likely next movements and what monitoring capabilities we could leave in the system. There were questions about the 3 planets that were gone and what the long-term status of those orbital zones would be and whether there were any remains to recover. I answered everything I could answer and referred the rest to the people better equipped to handle it. At 1800, the Veil delegation prepared to depart. Aelva stopped at the door of the conference bay. She turned and looked at me one more time, and I looked back at her. And for a moment we were simply 2 people who had ended up on opposite sides of the same morning, and were both still processing the fact that the morning had ended the way it had. "The Assembly will hear of this," she said. "Yes," I said. "They will have questions." "They usually do." Something moved at the edge of her expression that might have been humor, though Veil facial structure made it difficult to be certain. "I think," she said carefully, "that the category they have filed Earth under may need to be revised." I thought about the Drath AI trying to classify our fleet and running out of categories. I thought about 31 years of observer status and declined membership applications, and the careful, patient assumption that we were not relevant to situations that carried weight. "File it however you need to," I said. "We will still be here." She left. I stood in the empty conference bay for a while after the Veil ships had undocked, and I could hear the sounds of the Resolute settling back into its post-engagement operational rhythm. The hum of systems returning to standard load, the quiet communication traffic of a ship that had been at maximum capacity for the past several hours, and was now cycling down. Neil Cross found me there about 10 minutes later. He stood in the doorway and looked at me the way he sometimes did when he had something to say, and was deciding whether I needed to hear it immediately or whether it could wait until I had come back to myself from whatever I was in the middle of. "Preliminary casualty verification is complete," he said. 47 ships confirmed, 19,004. He paused. "The names will be compiled by 2100. Send them to my terminal when they are ready." "Yes, Admiral." He stayed in the doorway a moment longer. "For what it is worth," he said, "the fourth planet is still transmitting. They switched from the emergency frequency to a standard civilian broadcast band about an hour ago. Our communications team has been listening." "What are they transmitting?" Neil Cross looked at me. "They heard we were here," he said. "They are saying thank you." I nodded. I did not say anything for a moment. "Tell Owen to log it," I said. He nodded and left. I walked back to the bridge. The main display showed the Veil system in its current state: 1 living planet, 2 dormant ones, and 3 orbital paths where planets no longer were. The sun moved across the display at the center of everything, unchanged, continuing as it always continued, the way stars do when the things around them are in the process of either ending or beginning, without any particular preference for which. I sat down at my station. The preliminary casualty report was still there, face down on my desk. Next to it was the broken heating coil from the Kurosawa. I looked at it for a long moment. 22 years I had carried it, through 3 commands, 4 promotions, 11 years as emergency logistics director, and 47 morning when a signal had found my terminal through a routing path that should not have worked. Through every committee session where Earth had been politely set aside, through every declined application and every observer gallery session and every version of the phrase "too young, too far, too unknown." I had carried it the way you carry something that you do not know how to put down, because putting it down requires you to have somewhere to put it, and you have been moving too fast and too purposefully to find the right place. I looked at the display showing 1 surviving planet and its 290 million people who were, at this moment, switching from emergency frequencies to civilian broadcasts and saying the words thank you into a sky that had, this morning, been full of the wrong kind of ships. I picked up the coil. I held it for a moment. Then I set it down on the console, in the place where the station's surface met the display frame, in the narrow flat edge where it fit exactly as though it had been made for that specific spot. I left it there. I pulled up the departure planning interface and began the calculations for the journey home. 4,169 ships, 900 support vessels, a route back through the void that Lily Ford would need to begin plotting in the next 2 hours if we wanted to make the first fold window. There were 19,000 names coming to my terminal at 2100. I would read all of them tonight. I would start at the beginning and not stop until I had read every single one, the way I had once read 340 names on a list that had also started with other people's choices and ended on my desk. That was the work. That was always the work after. I pulled up the departure interface and started typing. Behind me, on the console edge, the broken heating coil from the Kurosawa sat in the light of the